Americans have long seen their soul, their failures, and their triumphs through their writers. No other country has produced such a noble body of literature as the United States. Hello, I'm Jane Kaczmarek, and welcome to the Great American Authors Series. In this episode of the Great American Authors Series, we meet writers who were known collectively as the Lost Generation. They were part of that turbulent era of American history known as the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. World-weary as well as sophisticated, they wrote in an autobiographical style, using their own experiences and traumas to peer into the psychology of America and reveal its most guarded secrets. As a result, this era became the golden age of American literature. The writers of the Lost Generation were the catalyst for two sweeping changes in the American novel. First, they rejected the conventional literary techniques of the past and experimented with radical new ways of storytelling. And second, publishers became more intimately involved with their authors' books. Thomas Wolfe was the culmination of these two changes.
The whole conviction of my life now rests upon the belief that loneliness, far from being a rare and curious phenomenon peculiar to myself and to a few other solitary men, is the central and inevitable fact of human existence.
Words taken from Thomas Wolfe's last novel, You Can't Go Home Again, a title that captured the essence of the Lost Generation. Indeed, perhaps no other Lost Generation writer impacted the style of the American novel the way Wolfe did. His elegant, lyrical prose evoked imagery and emotion like an impressionist's painting. More importantly, he completely rejected the traditional style of novels and created a new style, an autobiographical style that would become a major part of the way 20th century American writers would write. Fellow Southern author William Faulkner described Wolfe as the best of the Lost Generation writers. In his all too brief life, Wolfe's books were some of the greatest American literature ever written. The son of working-class parents, Thomas Clayton Wolfe was born on October 3, 1900, in Asheville, a small provincial mountain town in North Carolina. His father, Frank Wolfe, was an alcoholic who, when drunk, railed at his family while quoting Shakespeare. When his parents separated, Wolfe's mother, Julia, a strong, domineering woman, took Tom, the youngest of 8 children, to live with her in a boarding house, while his siblings stayed with their father. The intellectually gifted young Wolfe often felt alone in his mother's massive 18-room boarding house. He was also tall and gangly, reaching 6'5" and towering above others, all of which further added to his alienation within this small mountain town. Wolfe captured this alienation in his books, and throughout his life, he would seek the approval of his hometown. He finally got that chance with his first novel, Look Homeward, Angel. Max Perkins, an editor at Scribner's Publishers, recognized Wolfe's genius. Perkins was a new kind of editor, an editor who took an active role not only with the author, but also with the writing process itself. Perkins took Wolfe's first novel, a rambling, overly long manuscript, and helped Wolfe tighten it up into a masterpiece of fiction. At last, Wolfe would be able to show his hometown of Asheville how much he loved and respected them. But instead of approval, the citizens of Asheville were incensed with Wolfe's radically new autobiographical style. They accused him of writing a grotesque parody of his family and leaving no one in the town with a shred of dignity. Disappointed with the reviews from the people he called the heart of America, Wolfe sailed for Europe and started work on his next novel. Like his first, Of Time and the River would be an homage to his hometown. Wolfe died before he could complete his last 2 novels, The Web and The Rock, in 1939, and You Can't Go Home Again in 1940. In the spring of 1938, he gave Harper Publishers over 4,000 pages, 1.2 million words, and left for the West Coast. It was the last trip he would ever take. 6 months later, he would be dead from tuberculosis at the age of 37.
America's Lost Generation authors were known for their despair and worldly wanderings, but they were also recognized for their incomparable technical skills as writers. Indeed, they collected Nobel Prizes for literature in an unprecedented number, never equaled by any other country. Our next author was the most provincial member of the Lost Generation. William Faulkner spent most of his life in Mississippi, yet his novels are filled with universal truths that gained him a Nobel Prize in 1949.
William Faulkner was the third of the Deep South's parade of writers. Writers which included Mark Twain, Thomas Wolfe, and Truman Capote, all of whom would redefine stylistically how novels were written. William Faulkner was born in New Albany, Mississippi on September 25th in 1887. Raised in Mississippi, he was deeply influenced not only by the South's peculiar history, but by his own family's eccentric and daring past. William Clark Faulkner, his great-grandfather, served as a colonel in the Confederate Army, founded a railroad, and wrote novels, a literary tradition he passed down to his great-grandson. Indeed, Colonel Faulkner would become the model for Colonel John Sotoris in William Faulkner's novel, Sotoris. Like fellow Lost Generation author Thomas Wolfe, Faulkner grew up an outsider in his hometown, and even in his own family. He was a poet at heart, which further widened the rift between him and his family, especially his father. Reaching adulthood, Faulkner was a complex man, a man of contradictions. And though a member of the lost generation of writers, most of whom traveled to Europe, he rarely left his beloved Oxford, Mississippi. Faulkner began writing in 1925, but he did not achieve recognition until The Sound and the Fury, his masterpiece written in 1929. It not only showcased the South, but also the stream of consciousness style of writing Faulkner employed. A style that reveals a character's point of view through a sort of interior monologue that traces his thoughts and feelings regardless of punctuation or syntax. It was a style that Faulkner could explain only by saying that he was a vessel for the voices he heard.
I don't know where it came from. I don't know why the god or gods or whoever it was selected me to be the vessel.
Yet at the same time, Faulkner wrote that he was driven by demons to work, and that writing was a kind of insane catharsis.
You don't commit suicide when you are disappointed in love. You write a book.
The Sound and the Fury's themes included the decline of 19th century Southern society and the greedy standards of the New South arising in the 20th century. For 2 generations of readers, Faulkner's novels opened up the world of America's Deep South. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana had remained essentially unchanged since the Civil War. A part of the United States that was strangely distant, even unapproachable, from the rest of the country through the first half of the 20th century. But Faulkner changed all that. With a wry sense of humor, he revealed the South's deepest faults and showed its tragic relations between blacks and whites in a way that made other regions of the country sympathetic. One of Faulkner's greatest legacies is that he opened the door for Southern writers to speak about their experiences in the Deep South, such as Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, Truman Capote's Other Voices, Other Rooms, and John Berendt's Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. William Faulkner received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949, the fourth American to do so. He died on July 6, 1962.
The image of the Roaring Twenties was the flapper, the quick buck, and high society. It was that privileged society that mesmerized F. Scott Fitzgerald. But there was another side to the Roaring Twenties. It was Sinclair Lewis's Main Street and Elmer Gantry.
He was another gifted and brilliant writer from America's heartland. He wrote of himself that his life was ordinary and unromantic. A rather humdrum chronicle of much reading, constant writing, undistinguished travel, and several years of comfortable servitude as an editor. Yet his witty and sharp novels often pierced the veil of American society, uncovering the gritty truth that lay beneath, which made him the first American to win a Nobel Prize in 1930. He was Sinclair Lewis.
At being the first American to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature.
Born in Sauk Center, Minnesota on February 7, 1885. Sinclair Lewis was the old man of the Lost Generation writers, and the first one to achieve the phenomenal acclaim that followed all of these authors. He wrote his first novel, Hike and the Aeroplane, in 1912 under the pseudonym Tom Graham. By 1921, Lewis had 6 novels published. But it was in the decade of the Roaring Twenties that Lewis wrote his most successful and telling works, Main Street, Babbitt, and Elmer Gantry. No novel better expresses Lewis's appeal and satiric wit than Elmer Gantry. His indictment of fundamentalist religion through the title character, a greedy and philandering Baptist minister, is a satiric tour de force.
You've just got to have every woman, old, young, stupid, even poor, starved Rachel with her wet calf eyes.
May God strike me dead the second.
Be careful or he'll strike you stone dead for being the ungrateful liar that you are.
Sure.
Can't you ever tell the truth?
Capping the novel's theme is the fact that Gantry, though often exposed for the religious hypocrite he is never fully discredited. Lewis's Gantry character is a universal part of American life, still alive in the 21st century. All of these works, because they expose the darker side of not only the American dream, but America's small-town public image, earned the ultimate status of the period. They were banned in Boston, but were loved by the people. An alcoholic, Sinclair Lewis died on January 10, 1951, in Rome, Italy, from complications due to his alcoholism.
Pearl Buck began a new strain of American literature, an author who set her characters outside of America, in exotic foreign lands like China.
When Pearl Buck won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1938, the announcement was greeted with surprise and even protest. Many critics felt that she had not contributed enough to literature to warrant such an honor. But in retrospect, her life and her books now say differently. The Lost Generation period in American literature had many impressive women authors: Gertrude Stein, Josephine Herbst, Zora Neale Hurston, and Margaret Mitchell. But Pearl Buck was by far the most prolific, the most widely read, and the one who wrote such remarkable literature that it changed the attitudes of people throughout the world. Pearl Buck was born in the United States on June 26, 1892, the daughter of Presbyterian missionaries. At the age of 3 months, her parents took her to China. At 18, she attended college in America and returned to China 4 years later. In 1917, she married John Lossing Buck, an agricultural specialist. The couple later settled in Nanking. It was here that Buck began her writing career with her first novel, East Wind, West Wind, published in the United States in 1930. Her best-known work, The Good Earth, followed in 1931, and it won the 1932 Pulitzer Prize. Buck wrote the book in a unique voice, blending the biblical style of the King James Bible with the simple folk tales of China. The Good Earth tells the story of Wang Lun, a Chinese peasant whose love for the land keeps him going in a life filled with hardships. The Good Earth presented with great admiration and empathy the human condition of the people Buck had grown up with, whose language she had mastered and whose customs she had learned. Indeed, she brought the people of a once great empire into America's homes and showed that the Chinese embraced universal ideals of love, peace, and perseverance. Buck loved China and the Chinese people, and most likely would have stayed in Asia for the remainder of her life. But in 1934, political turmoil forced Buck and her husband to leave China, and they returned to the United States. In 1935, Buck married her second husband, Richard J. Walsh, the president of the John Day Publishing Company, and moved to a 60-acre farm she called Green Hills Farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Here she spent the second half of her life writing about her experiences in Asia. In 1937, The Good Earth was brought to an even wider audience when it was made into an Oscar-winning movie starring Paul Mooney and Louise Rayner. Pearl Buck wrote 65 books, including biographies of her missionary parents. In the end, Pearl Buck had opened the door for American authors to tell stories from beyond the nation's boundaries. 10 years after her death in 1973, she was honored with a commemorative U.S. stamp for her inspiring works.
In the 30s, America was thrown into the Great Depression. It would shape American writing for the next 2 generations. The watchword of the Depression was struggle, and no one struggled more with his personal demons than America's first and greatest playwright, Eugene O'Neill.
For you still did love me when we were married. You won't deny that, will you?
I don't deny anything.
All right, then. I came home to surrender to you what's inside me. I love you. I loved you then and the years between, and I love you now.
Ezra, please.
I want that said. Maybe you've forgotten it. I wouldn't blame you. I guess I didn't say it or show it much, ever. Something queer in me makes me mum about the things I like most to say, makes me hide the things I like to show. Something makes me sit numb in my own heart like a statue of a dead man in a town square. I want to find what that wall is that marriage put between us. You've got to help me smash it down. We have 20 good years still before us. I've been thinking of what we could do to bring us back to each other. I have a notion that if we leave the children, go off on a voyage together to the other side of the world, find some island where we could be alone, you'll find that I've changed, Christine. I'm sick of death. I want life. Maybe you could love me now. I've got to make you love me.
Oh, for God's sake, stop talking. I don't know what you're saying. Leave me alone. What must be, must be. You make me weak. It's getting late.
Those were the words of America's greatest playwright, Eugene O'Neill. And as a playwright, Eugene O'Neill introduced to American theater the dramatic realism pioneered in Europe by Russia's Anton Chekhov and Norway's Henrik Ibsen. Indeed, he was the first American to use truly American dialect in his plays. O'Neill was born in New York City on October 16, 1888, son of a popular actor, James O'Neill. Like other Lost Generation writers, as a young man, he wandered aimlessly around the world, wrestling with the tragedies of life. In 1914, he decided to become a playwright. Settling down, he wrote a remarkable collection of plays that reflected his own despair. They won him 4 Pulitzers and a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1936. In 1941, he wrote his greatest play, the autobiographical Long Day's Journey into Night. Arthur Miller, who would follow in O'Neill's footsteps, wrote, "O'Neill was a great wrestler, fighting God to a standstill." He wrote until the mid-1940s, when a debilitating muscular disease ended his playwriting career. He died on November 27, 1953.
John Steinbeck gave us the greatest stories of the Depression, and then, like the country, he moved on, creating great literature for the next 25 years.
His novels carried on the long American literary tradition of social activism begun by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Yet at the same time, each of his novels was a turning point, a redefinition of his life. He was Nobel Prize winner John Steinbeck. Steinbeck was born in Salinas, California on February 27, 1902. He grew up close to the land, working summers as a hired hand on nearby ranches. In the 1920s, in order to support his ambition to become a writer, Steinbeck took odd jobs: construction worker, painter, caretaker, and fruit picker. From all these experiences, Steinbeck would gather the images and themes of his books. Steinbeck's career took off in 1935 with the publication of Tortilla Flat, about pleasure-seeking Mexican-American workers. Of Mice and Men was Steinbeck's next great success. Far removed from the happy-go-lucky theme of Tortilla Flat, this novel told a story of shattered dreams. It was a theme Steinbeck would return to again and again throughout his career. In Of Mice and Men, George Milton and Lenny Small are 2 wandering ranch hands who dream someday of owning their own place. Finding work on a ranch, they save their money, but their hopes go awry when Lenny accidentally kills the ranch owner's daughter. And George is forced to shoot his friend before a vigilante crowd can kill him. All of Steinbeck's novels can be considered social novels. He captured the desperation of the American worker, the plight of the land, and the falseness of the American dream. And it was in The Grapes of Wrath that Steinbeck's social activism reached its peak. The novel's title sprang from Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic, written in 1861, and it shared the song's theme of freedom for oppressed workers. The novel follows the Joad family as they travel from the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma in the 1930s to the Promised Land of California, looking for a better life, only to become migrant workers. With The Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck introduced a realist style into his narrative. Visiting the migrant worker camps, he witnessed the unsanitary living conditions, the starving children, the desperate people.
This lady's bleeding to death.
Boy, what a mess them 45s make. Better get the doc.
He learned their speech patterns and their stories, all of which found their way into his novel. Angry about their ill treatment, Steinbeck poured his soul and his protest into the grapes of wrath. Indeed, the most oft-quoted lines of the poem sum up the underlying premise of so many of Steinbeck's books.
Before I knowed it, I was saying out loud, "The hell with it. There ain't no sin, there ain't no virtue. There's just stuff people do. It's all part of the same thing. Maybe all men got one big soul everybody's a part of." And I sat there thinking it. And all of a sudden I knew it. I knew it so deep down that it was true. And I still know it. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath.
Steinbeck resisted repeating the successful storylines of his novels in the 30s and branched out in a completely new direction. In 1941, he teamed up with longtime friend and marine biologist Ed Ricketts to collect specimens in the Sea of Cortez. He later chronicled the expedition in a book titled The Log from the Sea of Cortez. In the 1950s, Steinbeck reinvented himself again, this time with what has been called his most ambitious work, East of Eden. Indeed, Steinbeck wrote of the book, "I think everything else I have written has been, in a sense, practiced for this." East of Eden interweaves the stories of two families, the Trasks and Hamiltons, with themes of love, self-destruction, and the struggle for acceptance. And it has many parallels with the biblical story of Cain and Abel. In fact, once more Steinbeck looked to another source for his title, this time the King James Bible. "And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden." East of Eden was made into a movie with one of the biggest stars of all time, James Dean. In 1962, Steinbeck once more reached deep inside himself and found a new direction for his writing. Travels with Charlie is Steinbeck's account of traveling around the country with his dog Charlie in search of the real America. The book turned out to be one of Steinbeck's biggest commercial successes. In 1962, Steinbeck received the Nobel Prize for Literature. Some critics believe Steinbeck was past his prime and did not deserve the award. But the Nobel Committee recognized the breadth and importance of Steinbeck's novels with these words: "For his realistic and imaginative writings, combining as they do sympathetic humor and keen social perception." John Steinbeck died on December 20th, 1968.
In the next episode, the greatest of the Lost Generation writers, Ernest Hemingway, makes his mark. At the same time, American authors respond to the hollow images of a world gone crazy with war and technology. Thanks for watching episode 5 of the Great American Authors series. I'm Jane Kaczmarek.
Thank you.